According to legend, there was a 15th century Scotsman named Alexander Sawney Bean who lived in a cave in southwest Scotland. And it's said that he, his wife, and his growing incestuous family killed and ate over 1,000 people. In today's episode, well, we're going to talk about that. First, we'll go over the story of Sawney Bean and his incestuous cannibal family, the inspiration for the Hills Have Eyes horror franchise, originally written and directed by Wes Craven in 1977. Though the first version I saw, I'll be honest, was the 2006 remake with Buffalo Bill, which is Ted Levine, as the dad. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was also partly inspired by Sawney Bean, along with other serial killers like Ed Gein. That kind of rhymes. And there are tons of other Sawney Bean references in games, movies, songs, and TV shows. Sorry, I got a little off track there, as usual. And you know what? Since I'm off track, let me shout out my two newest cannibal patrons, Zach O and Linda W. How fitting that you're now both on Team Cannibal, and today's episode is all about cannibalism. I love that you've joined, and thank you so much for your support. It really means a lot. And if you want to be lovely like Linda or zesty like Zach, who, by the way, just gave me a brilliant idea for a podcast episode that's going to be coming up in the next few months, then come on over and join us at Patreon. You can join You can join for free to show your support, or you can pledge $5 or $10 a month for extra perks like bonus content. But let's get back to the show. So first, we'll go over the story itself. It's pretty sensational in all meanings of the word. So after that, we'll do the history and we'll dig into the source material to find out how credible this story really is. We'll also take a look at the historical context. If this story is just fiction, then how and why was it created? What purpose did it serve? What was going on in history that explains why someone came up with a story about an incestuous, cannibal Scottish family who lived in a cave, terrorizing and eating the locals? We've done episodes like this before, reading a pretty gruesome story, then digging into the source material to determine its credibility. One of my favorites was The Werewolf of Bedburg, so go check out that episode when you're done here. This episode is dedicated to my Scottish fans and family, and let me know in the comments if you've ever heard of Sawney Bean, Scotland's most famous cannibal. So let's get started. First, let's go over the story of Sawney Bean. This version was the one published in 1826 in the Newgate Calendar, a London-based series of crime stories. Our story takes place in the 17th century, that's the 1600s. According to the legend, Alexander Bean was born in East Lothian, about 8 miles or so outside Edinburgh. Though he was born Alexander, he went by his middle name Sawney, or at least his nickname, Sawney. And though his parents worked hard to provide for him, Sawney was idle and didn't care much for working. He met a woman named Black Agnes Douglas, purportedly a witch, because of course she was, who was equally as idle and, quote, viciously inclined, and the two of them decided to leave the East and settle in the West, and I am quoting from the original source here, quote, in a rock by the seaside on the shore of the county of Galloway, where they lived upwards of 25 years without going into any city, town, or village, end quote. So you may wonder then, if they didn't go into town at all, how could they survive living in a rock on the seaside? Cannibalism, my friends. Cannibalism. Now, Sawney Bean and his wife had a bunch of children, and their children engaged in incest and had a bunch of grandchildren, or Sawney's grandchildren at least, and the whole brood lived in a cave. To survive, they robbed and they killed, taking whatever goods they needed off their victims and then eating them for sustenance. And here's another direct quote from the source, quote, by this bloody method, and their living so retiredly from the world, they continued such a long time undiscovered, there being nobody able to guess how the people were lost and went by the place where they lived. As soon as they had robbed and murdered any man, woman, or child, they used to carry off the carcass to the den, where, cutting it into quarters, they would pickle the mangled limbs and afterwards eat it, this being their only sustenance. End quote. Leftover bits, or food that they didn't eat in time and rotted, were tossed into the ocean, and apparently limbs would wash ashore in nearby towns, and the locals who didn't know about the beans were always perplexed as to why, limbs kept washing in with the tides. Searches turned up nothing. The cave where the beans lived didn't look like a habitable place from the shore. It was dark, it flooded a good bit with the tide, and there was no evidence of human settlement anywhere near the entrance. According to the story, the beans lived way in the back of the cave where they wouldn't have been seen and where the floods wouldn't have washed them out. Fear and chaos led to scapegoating, as it often does. Several local innkeepers were killed on suspicion of being the murderer. And the source tells us that this, of course, was very inconvenient for any travelers who couldn't find lodging, on account of the innkeepers all being killed and whatnot. The Beans were apparently super careful to not ambush more than 6 people if they were on foot, or 2 if they were on horseback. First, they wanted the meat, and second, they didn't want any survivors to run away and report what they had seen. And in this way, the killings continued for around 25 years. The story tells us that they butchered more than 1,000 men, women, and children. And then one night, the Bean family fell upon a husband and wife riding the same horse, coming home from a local fair. It was an ambush. The husband fought back against the Beans, riding them down with his horse, but in the kerfuffle, I really just wanted to be able to say the word kerfuffle, I'll be honest. In the kerfuffle, the wife fell off the back of the horse, and the women in the Bean attack pounced. Here's a quote from the source. Quote, "The poor woman fell from behind him and was instantly murdered before her husband's face. For the female cannibals cut her throat and fell to sucking her blood with as great a gust as if it had been wine." Oh man, don't ruin wine for me. This done, they ripped out her belly and pulled out all her entrails. Such a dreadful spectacle made the man make the more obstinate resistance, as expecting the same fate if he fell into their hands. While he was engaged, 20 or 30 from the same fair came together in a body, upon which Sawney Bean and his bloodthirsty clan withdrew, and made the best of their way through a thick wood to their den. End quote. And this guy was the first of Sawney Bean's victims to make it out of an ambush at least, alive. His wife's body, though partially pulled off into the woods, was abandoned by the Beans so they could escape, so he paraded it around to show the locals what was done. That's kind of gross if you think about it. Like, here's my partially consumed wife. Look at her. Anyway, news of the tragedy traveled all around Scotland, and then it made its way down to London. Now, in this story at least, King James I, the same one who was super anti-witchcraft, if you've listened to any of my English witch hunting episodes and witch trial episodes lately, he came up to join the hunt for the Beans. Now, normally, the cave where the Beans lived kept them safe. Again, it didn't look habitable or even accessible. But King James brought bloodhounds with him, and if you don't already know this about bloodhounds, they have an exceptional sense of smell and the ability to track down a scent over long distances. They're not the only dogs who are good at hunting and tracking, but they've certainly got that reputation for being among the best. And it's a good thing that James brought the dogs with him, because when they came by like smelling distance of the cave and they went to go explore it a little, they sniffed out the Bean family. And here's what they found. And I'm going to quote the source again because I love a good original text. Quote, "They went in and were all so shocked at what they beheld that they were almost ready to sink into the earth. Legs, arms, thighs, hands, and feet of men, women, and children were hung up in rows like dried beef. A great many limbs lay in pickle, and a great mass of money, both gold and silver, with watches, rings, swords, pistols, and a large quantity of clothes, both linen and woolen, and an infinite number of other things which they had taken from those whom they had murdered, were thrown together in heaps or hung up against the sides of the den. Sawney's family at this time, besides him, consisted of his wife, 8 sons, 6 daughters, 18 grandsons, and 14 granddaughters, who were all begotten in incest. These were all seized and pinioned by His Majesty's order in the first place. Then they took what human flesh they found and buried it in the sands. End quote. The Beans were carted back off to Edinburgh and committed to the toll booth, which is a municipal building, if you will, and a jail, mostly, where prisoners were routinely tortured. But the Beans didn't stay there long, as they were executed the next day without a trial. I guess they figured they had enough evidence, caught him literally red-handed, just gave him an execution. The men went first. Our guy, Sawney Bean, his sons and his grandsons. The source tells us, and sorry in advance to the men out there listening to this, their genitals were cut off and then thrown into the fire, and they were all made to watch. Then their hands and legs were cut off, and they were thrown into the fire also, and the men were left to bleed out, which apparently took quite some time. And once the menfolk were dead, the women were next, the wife, daughters, and granddaughters, who had just watched what happened to the men of their family. But they weren't killed the same way. They were gathered together and tied around 3 different poles, and then they were all set on fire. So very witchcraft execution style, right? And apparently, none of the lot were very repentant, and they died spitting curses and vitriol and how dare you and we'll get you for this and all that kind of stuff. And that is the original story of Sawney Bean, the Scottish cannibal. I have so many questions. So many questions. But the first set of questions we need to explore are, when did this story first appear in print? Is there even a shred of credibility to the story, or is it just fiction? And if it's fiction, why are the English, because it was first published by the British, why are the English writing horror stories about the Scottish like this? It's time for some historical context to figure out what is going on here. Now, according to historian and author Ronald Holmes, the earliest known publication of Sawney Bean's story appeared in print in Carlisle around the year 1700. Gory stories were in. I don't think I need to explain why. It's probably why you're listening to my podcast, or why I run a podcast and show based on gross stories, or why true crime is so popular. And the Sawney Bean story was gory. Side tangent, though it is relevant. Though Sawney Bean's story was first published in 1700, it would have been the perfect story for the penny dreadfuls, which were cheap serial books from the 1800s that covered stories like this. They were called penny dreadfuls because they cost a penny and were usually, well, dreadful, or at least the characters in them were. For example, the story of Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, first appeared in a penny dreadful. And there were later penny dreadfuls of Sawney Bean as well, so it's pretty fitting. Anyways, from Carlisle, the story traveled to Hull, then Birmingham, and then London, where it was told over and over again in various formats, including the most popular version that I used earlier for my retelling of the legend. And Carlisle, by the way, is in the north of England, very near the Scottish border. So, why on earth did a story about a Scottish cannibal pop up in northern England in 1700? Well, in my head, the first place I go to is anti-Scottish sentiment. Perhaps the English wanted to paint the Scottish in a bad light. Resident expert Ronald Holmes certainly thought so, arguing that, quote, "It is highly indicative that the legend of Sawney Bean was published only in England during the first 100 years of its existence in print, since it combined a sense of wonder, degradation of a traditional enemy, and so many well-known aspects of folktale and history, it must have been something of a bestseller." Accusations of cannibalism as a weapon of propaganda is very old indeed, and was used during this period. It was used during the Great Rebellion in England, and was to be used again against the French during their revolution. Against this background, it may be believed that the legend of Sawney Bean was used as anti-Scottish propaganda. If so, it seemed to have some success, for the evidence shows that some people believed that the Scots ate children during the 1745 rebellion. End quote. Interesting. Well, first, were there any events going on around this period of time that might support Ronald Holmes' theory? Maybe that 1745 rebellion that he referenced? Well, I can think of 2. The 1745 Jacobite rebellion and the suppression of the Covenanters. Let's do that latter one first. In the wake of the Protestant Reformation, because of course we have to talk about the Protestant Reformation again, England converted to Anglicanism under King Henry VIII in 1534, and we also call that the Church of England, right? But in Scotland, the Church of Scotland adopted Presbyterianism under the teachings of John Knox, and the Covenanters were an active group of Presbyterians in Scotland. They were called the Covenanters because they signed the Scottish National Covenant in 1638, pledging to maintain their faith and form of worship. The English kings, however, were not too keen about this, seeing it as a rebellion against the crown. Long story short and simplified, it led to several conflicts between Scotland and England, and some Covenanters even got involved in the English Civil Wars, at first against King Charles, but then later against Oliver Cromwell. It gets kind of complicated, and it's not the point of today's story. But the argument is, did the English author a story painting the Scots as cannibals because of these tensions and conflicts? The other thing I can think of that Robert Holmes brought up as well is the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745. Now, I talked about this in more detail in my episode on the Order of the Pug, which was a secret society founded by Roman Catholics where its members acted like pugs. The dogs. It was weird. You should go listen. That was a weird one. Not gory, just weird. But the short version of the Jacobite Rebellion is that some Scots and disaffected Englishmen were unhappy with the king at the time, George II. Now, back in 1688, the very Catholic King James II lost the throne during the Glorious Revolution, where his daughter Mary, along with her husband William, took power. After William and Mary, we get Queen Anne, then King George I, and then King George II. But meanwhile, James II's line was in exile. He was the one who was kicked out, right? Including his grandson, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, better known to history as Bonnie Prince Charlie. The Scots and disgruntled Englishmen helped support Bonnie Prince Charlie's campaign to come back over to England and take the throne, which he considered rightfully his. And had he succeeded, he would have been crowned James II. So his supporters called themselves Jacobites, taken from the Latin for James, which is Jacobus. Jacobus? I don't do Latin, I'm sorry. Jacobus. Jacobus. I feel like it's Jacobus. Over a series of uprisings and battles starting in the late 1600s and culminating at the Battle of Culloden in 1746, the Jacobites lost their bid to put Bonnie Prince Charlie on the throne. Bonnie Prince Charlie was deserted by many of his followers, his wife left him, and he died in Rome in 1788 as a pretty broken man. And if there are any Outlander fans out there, what I just described is the setting for the first two books. So the theory about Sawney Bean, then, is that perhaps the English wanted to paint the Scots as man-eaters, as horrible, violent, bloodthirsty cannibals, at least that one Scotsman, Sawney Bean. But as novelist and journalist Sean Thomas notes in an article about Sawney Bean, quote, "But this idea, at least to my mind, is a bit feeble. For a start, the penny dreadfuls and broadsheets that tell of Sawney Bean are also full of hair-raising tales about highwaymen and pirates. Is the tale of Dick Turpin an attack on Essex boys? Surely not. If the Sawney Bean story is to be read as deliberately anti-Scottish, how do we explain the equal emphasis on English criminals in the same publications? Wouldn't such an approach rather blunt the point?" End quote. And he's got an argument there. He's got a point. So maybe it is just a story, and a really successful one considering the sheer number of pop culture references attached to it. But regardless of the original intention behind the Sawney Bean story, it definitely had the effect of making the Scots seem violent and inhumane, evidenced in part by the widespread rumors that the Scots were cannibals circulating around before the Jacobite Rebellion. So what I want to know then, now that we know a little bit more about the time period, is did Sawney Bean even exist? Was Sawney Bean a real person? So what evidence can we look for to prove a person's existence? Well, in this period of English and Scottish history, we would look to court records, jail records, execution records, even just local accounts and sources. I mean, even King James I supposedly got involved in this version of the story, so it would be referenced somewhere in court documents, right? At least one would think. Well, it's nowhere. There is no mention of an Alexander Sawney Bean in any arrests or execution records, and we have records for people with much lesser crimes than the one Sawney Bean and his incestuous cannibal family were accused of committing. But there's nothing. We have no proof of his capture, arrest, or execution beyond what was printed in newspapers as fictional crime stories or, of course, the Penny Dreadfuls. And there are no royal records from James' first time that corroborate the story of him even traveling up to Scotland to hunt for the killer family. And if the Sawney Beans, if the Bean family did kill and consume over 1,000 people from that relatively small little area around Galloway, wouldn't there be newspaper sources that talk about, all of the missing people? There's nothing there, because it's just a story. Which I think we could all have assumed anyway. It sounds a little bit too over the top to be real. Which, again, reminds me on my episode on Peter Stump, the werewolf of Bedburg. He faced similar accusations that just sounded too gory to be real. So I feel pretty confident saying that Sawney Bean, at least the iteration we get, was not real. Maybe he was based on a real person and highly, grossly exaggerated over time. As Sean Thomas writes in his article, quote, "To add to the intrigue, we do know that cannibalism was not unknown in medieval Scotland, and that Galloway was in medieval times a very lawless place. Perhaps nothing on the scale of the Bean legends took place, but every story grows and is embroidered over time." End quote. So what can we take away from this story? Well, I like the way that Blaine Pardo puts it. Quote, "Why does this story have such long-lasting appeal? Is it morbid curiosity or something more? People have a need to experience fear and the survival of that terror. This is why horror novels and films have such a great following. We want to face evil, even if that evil is imaginary. Serial killers fascinate us and are a booming business for true crime authors. There is something deeply sinister about someone who mass murders. And there is the cannibalism aspect of the tale, too, which makes people squirm. Toss in incest and a king involved in the manhunt, and you have the makings of a compelling story to read." End quote. And he's not wrong. Again, you're here listening to this story, and I'm the one telling it. But curiously, what started off as an English story has morphed into a piece of Scottish folklore, accepted as truth despite its clearly fictional elements. And now, Sawney Bean has become part of the tourism industry. You can watch a Sawney Bean show at the Edinburgh Dungeon. You can go visit his supposed cave dwelling at Ballantrae, eat at various Sawney Bean-named pubs, and more. There's a Sawney Bean's Pub and Grill in Dumfries, not too far away from where he supposedly lived and operated. I'm pretty sure it's still in business, and if so, I'll be visiting next time I visit Scotland. There's even a Sawney Bean restaurant and pub outside Winnipeg in Canada. He's everywhere nowadays. So perhaps, sometimes, we don't have to find the hidden history that explains a story. Sometimes it really might just be a story, even if it's rooted in history and has definitely changed the course of it. Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Scottish cannibal, Sawney Bean. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things, subscribe to AFOUT on YouTube, and check out the musician who created the song you're hearing right now, Yellowcake. You can find him everywhere as Nedrick and Nedrick Music, and he's got 3 albums out just for you to listen to. Links for all of that are in the description. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.